Dmitry, you wanted to tell us about the Federal Reserve System everybody fears lately. What is it? Yes, in fact, many people write and talk about Federal Reserve System, but I never saw one video that would tell me all about it from A to Z. So that after watching it, you would know almost everything about it. In addition to that, I'd like to make some connections that are being left out even by those talking about Federal Reserve System. Therefore, we need a video like that in the internet. But first, two good news to link this video with our previous ones. We're shooting now at the beginning of April a video using our central bank statistics. In the last 2 weeks, our gold and foreign currency reserves have grown. It looks optimistic if you compare this tendency to what was happening in March of last year. This was the first thing we discussed. Oh, I see. The central bank is not spending money to support the ruble to dollar rate. Yes, we hope the viewers of your channel also understand this. And another 2-week-old news. Madam Nabiullina finally spoke up and said what you and I already talked about earlier, why central bank raised the key rate. She explained that we're saving bank deposits from withdrawal. She made the news public today. So from that perspective, this educational TV channel is ahead of others. Now let's move on to our today's topic. We mention the Federal Reserve System in every video and get questions about how it is connected to the central bank. We will talk about its history. The key point in the modern Federal Reserve System timeline is 1913, when it was created. Let's clarify that it is the Federal Reserve System of the USA and not of the whole world. I'll tell you more. In 1913, it was founded as the independent federal agency to function as a central bank. This term federal we're going to use often. I'm making an accent on it. And some dates I will mention today, like January 6, 2014. That's one of the major events. Janet Yellen became the head of Federal Reserve. It doesn't tell us anything at the moment.
То, что мы о ФРС слышали, может быть, так из крупных событий последний раз, это его возглавила Джанет Йеллен. Женщина, пока что нам это...
We can also say that Ben Bernanke had been the head of Federal Reserve before her since February 2006. He is famous for suggesting to throw money from a helicopter. He was joking. True, he said so. That's why he got a nickname, Helicopter.
Он пошутил-то. Да. Если нужно, он говорит, мы будем разбрасывать деньги с вертолетом. За это и получил прозвище вертолет. Да, ну, просто мало...
Yes, perhaps not everyone knows this. His full name is Ben Shalom Bernanke. He's a Jewish American, and Janet Yellen is his deputy. Because when they had an election, they had another candidate who the Liberal Democrats were not happy about. So he stepped back. It's an interesting moment. The Democrats didn't let him win, keeping Ben Bernanke's politics. Now let's talk about more detailed events related to Federal Reserve. First of all, you might be curious why I drew those two events somewhere in the middle. Yes, I was thinking you're not making good use of the paper. We'll start even earlier, because 1913 is the beginning of the Federal Reserve we know today, considering the changes we're going to mention. It all started much earlier. If we talk about the US solely, it all started in 1791. The first bank was created in the US. To make it more clear, We are going to write one more date around here. 1776. That's the year the United States were created. The Declaration of Independence, the 4th of July. Only 15 years later, the first bank is created as a prototype of future Federal Reserve System. Once again, it is the independent agency to function as a central bank. That's an interesting way to word this. What happened? You couldn't create the central bank? Why the function of a central bank? Everybody has a central bank and you have an independent agency? It sounds strange. The history of the United States starts with this date, the history of the Federal Reserve System. But I would add yet another date here. It's 1694, the creation of the Bank of England. So I would start the chain of logic from here, from 1694. First they create the Bank of England, then they move it to the USA 15 years later. It looks as if the USA was created to move the money printing machine. Because only in 15 years after the Declaration of Independence, the first bank appears. We have to mention that the Bank of England was also a private bank. Yes, just like Federal Reserve System, it is also independent. And here's what's really interesting. Who controls the Federal Reserve System? And we're going to reveal the truth. Nobody knows. Yes, nobody knows, and we're going to expose it. Anyway, this first bank didn't last long, until 1811. What happened at that time is its permissions were not extended. In other words, the bank didn't justify confidence, and until 1816 there was no Federal Reserve System in the US. They had a private bank system. The next date that could be marked is 1836. Why I like to write dates is that it creates associations. We're going to talk about other countries and events happening at those times around the world. So until 1816, there was nothing important here. Then there was another bank. As far as I remember, this first bank was a private bank. It wasn't a national bank. True, the first bank, just like the Federal Reserve System, is a private organization. And in 1816, bankers were successful to create the second bank. And from 1816 to 1836, the second bank was functioning successfully. However, in 1836, a very curious event occurs. The President Andrew Jackson uses his power to put the end to its privileges. Until 1862, there was another bank-free era. Wasn't he shot at for that? We're going to say that in a minute. There's even a name for it. It's called the era of free banking. That means there was no control over the banks. And the most interesting part is that every bank printed its own currency at that time. And starting in 1862, we see the appearance of the national banking system. And this era of national banks lasted until 1913. To put it simply, that chain of national banks is the same as federal banks inside the Federal Reserve System nowadays. They don't say that this era from 1862 to 1913 had no unity in the banking system. Those national banks did try to form a structure. Why are the national banks called this way? They're like federal banks.
Вот эти национальные банки пытались
So they're not state-operated?
структуру.
Национальный банк почему так называют?
No, the term national is just as misleading as the term
То
federal.
есть они не государственные.
The Federal Reserve System seems like it is state-operated. So do the national banks. We have examples like that in Russia as well.
Тоже есть примеры.
The National Reserve Bank has nothing to do with the national reserves. It's just a name.
Интересные вещи. Сейчас мы о них начнем уже разговаривать.
And here's some interesting things for you.
Третий
1873. There's not much space in here to write it.
1907
1893 and 1907.
в США.
There's a series of panics among the US banks.
То есть вот эти вот
So the banks show that they can't exist without the central control. They show they try, but they can't go on their own. Somebody needs to manage the banking system.
То есть буквально вот
So the first wave wasn't working. The second wave in 1893 wasn't working. In 1907, another one wasn't working.
все понимают,
It felt like if nothing changes, US would stop existing.
что станет, видимо, существовать.
А что,
So what were they doing? Officially, modern analytics say the problem was in the lack of dollar elasticity and the lack of liquidity. To me, it's surprising.
Кстати, удивительный момент, потому что
для меня
To many viewers, it means nothing. To me, those are economic terms, and they are surprising in a sense that the country needs to do something if there's a lack of cash.
ликвидность, это значит, что
We can see some similarities with our current situation in Russia.
все сейчас
We
понимают,
need to start building something, and we're waiting for some abstract investors instead of printing enough cash and building what's necessary.
построить нужный объект.
And we're trying to find funding abroad. I want to remind our viewers that finding foreign investors is simply giving our resources away. Because if you want to do something in your country, all you need is build it, invest in your own money. In case you don't have the technology, you buy it.
Заводы,
You can buy manufacturing like they did during Stalin's years. But finding foreign investors means you give a piece of land to somebody so that they can build a factory there or something while you can do it yourself.
якобы недостаточно.
So things like that, the lack of liquidity, the lack of cash is what was happening during those years. And this is strange because the banks could print money. They had different types of dollars, even the catalogs of dollars. Yes. Perhaps they wanted to cause the collapse of the system to finally take control over everything.
Анализировал кризис, например,
We will see the logic of the Federal Reserve System actions later.
более ранее, они
Those who analyzed the mortgage crisis in 2008 in the US say how they recovered from the crisis. A large bank family took a smaller bank into possession. Small ones went bankrupt, and the big ones made them part of their system. The crisis is when the bigger companies eat up the smaller ones. You're absolutely right. And we're the people who only now, in the last few years, try to analyze the politics. Others read about the crises of 2008 and realize that the large banks only got larger during the crisis. And I'm going to parallel this situation to what was happening in the past to show how much has changed since then.
депрессия, она так и продолжалась.
As I understand it, the series of depressions was used to make the creation of the third bank possible. Let's write it down.
Третий банк.
They already knew the taste of having the control in their own hands.
Знали, как это?
And later we'll see how they built an empire. Most likely, it wasn't like they could taste the control, but rather it was their initial intention when they moved the money printing machine from England to America.
Да, то есть вы там пока барахтаетесь, пока мы...
Yes, it was sort of like they let others hang out while they arranged the series of crises. And this way, everything would belong to them, one way or another, to put it simply. I want to bring your attention back to 1836, when the president of that time, Andrew Jackson, closed the second bank. The same thing is happening.
Там было сделано то же самое. Вот здесь мы
1834 is the year of recession. They arranged the recession. It's also the financial decline.
они организуют рецессию.
Yes, and here in 1835, there was an attempt at killing Jackson. He already made his intention of closing the bank clear.
35-й
So they tried to destabilize the situation by murdering him.
говорил, что он будет
The
закрывать.
attempt failed.
И вот они
The
пытались
gun misfired twice, which is very strange.
президентов, вот организуя рецессию, потом покушение, причем покушение было
And the next year, he closed the bank. The bankers were fighting for their privileges, but nobody talks about the key issues.
без разговоров.
People talk about the events in general without getting into details. But we see very interesting events happening before those, like recession arrangements, president murder attempts, the intention to close the bank.
Первый банк в таком-то году, потом вот он прекратил существование, не продлили ему, второй тогда-то, не поясняют.
Jackson is Scottish, by the way. He has Irish and Scottish background, just like most US citizens at that time. Well, at least he's not English.
Закрыть, происходят интересные события, организуется рецессия.
Here we see a series of events. Let's highlight it with red. Recessions, recessions, recessions. They make it clear that the national banks are unable to control the situation.
Англичанин чистый, а он вот шотландец.
Someone needs to take charge of it, and that's how Federal Reserve System started. I'll say it again.
Тоже рецессия.
It's an agency that functions as a central bank. It is strange that it is not the central bank that does it.
Вот в 13 году
And what in the history of the world do we associate this year with?
агентство
1913 and later.
выполняет функции
World War I,
стран.
1914.
А вот с чем у нас ассоциируется вот этот
Yes, it's an interesting moment, isn't it? Before that moment, there was no world war in the world. Of course, we can recall Napoleon's war in 1812,
не было, да? И так мы что можем вспомнить? Это
here in Russia at least. Okay, Crimean War. But the world war that the whole world acknowledged to be the world war happened right there in 1914.
Если вот в этом масштабе,
If we are talking about the time scale.
интересно.
It's interesting, isn't it? The Federal Reserve System is founded and the war begins next year. Technically, the war begins in Europe,
Слушай, американцы
not in the world.
Тогда, чтобы
Yet, it's called the World War.
там зрители
Well, listen, Americans didn't take part in it. Okay, to convince you and our viewers, I'll name a few more curious numbers so that we can talk about the whole world.
1917
Let's take Mexico, for example.
год. Ну, Россия. Все знают.
The revolution in Mexico happened in 1910 through 1917. In Russia, everybody knows this, it's 1905 and then 1916, 1917. Because we have to take into account the bourgeois revolution in February. Then Turkey. Turkey is an especially interesting subject because the revolution there was arranged by our men. I've been there. Together with other Turk, we can see our military chief monuments. They helped the Turks. Okay, Turkey 1908, 1909, and then 1918, 1923. Iran 1905, 1911. China 1911 and 1925, 1927.
Я не буду там много.
I'm not going to list a lot here. Well, India 1905, 1908 and 1919, 1920. Here's just the sampling of the big countries. Germany is not on the list. Let's say Germany 1918. What happened there? A revolution just like ours.
Революция, так же,
How come we don't know about it?
ничего не знаем.
а
What do you mean we don't know? Trotsky went there to make it happen. It's interesting that our man went to Germany, Turkey, and then we know that Trotsky lived in Mexico. We look and see that there was a revolution there in 1910, 1917. It's a special story about Trotsky. Was he deported there? And why did he go to Mexico? When we look at it more closely, we see that this was an era of world war and world revolutions. It's all happening around that time, the beginning of the 20th century. Yes, what an amazing coincidence. And the question is whether it's a coincidence or not. Let's go back to the Federal Reserve System. Our goal is to follow its trails. It will become clear in a moment why I mentioned the revolution at all. We will further mark 1923 on this timeline. The Federal Reserve established an open market investment committee. It was meant to coordinate the Federal Reserve activity. For the first time, a few federal banks became part of the Federal Reserve: the Bank of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Cleveland. It all sounds familiar: open market and so on. Yes, I'll explain it further, and it will get even more exciting. So those banks are the pioneers. Let me say it again: an open market investment committee. It's an important landmark in the history of the Federal Reserve when these banks became part of it. And we'll come back to what preceded that event in a moment. The second landmark is 1930, when the system of 12 federal banks formed. I am not going to list them here. These are the banks that are part of the Federal Reserve System now, and the committee is renamed into the Association of Open Market Policy. Everything seems open and clear. What I wanted to emphasize is this: from 1913 till 1923 is a closed period. Who was in charge during that time? By 1923, everything had already happened if we look at the major events around the globe. The World War I was over. The revolutions were over. And then there was this open market committee, and these first 5 banks were called to cooperate. And when it all settled down, then there were 12 banks, and the committee got renamed into the association. The question is, what was here in the early years of the 20th century? Very interesting events happened a bit earlier. 1910. I'm going to make a note here on my plot. When it became clear after a series of recessions that it's necessary to go back to the idea of a central bank, Senator Aldrich went to Europe to study the experience of the European banks. He felt skeptical. However, he took a look at the German experience, and the Federal Reserve is based on the German central banking experience. So it wasn't a fresh idea. It was the German experience they used, and they sort of tried to repeat it. And it will be clear why I'm saying sort of in a moment.
Не придумка как бы историческая там получается, а это вот они посмотрели, как там это происходит.
U.S. Congress listened to Aldrich and Vreeland, and the so-called Aldrich-Vreeland Act was passed that established the National Monetary Commission, which was supposed to figure out a way to avoid future recessions. We know now that it created the Federal Reserve System. But how did it all happen? In 1910, the leading economists, Nelson Aldrich, Paul Warburg, a well-known banker,
В 1910 году ведущие экономисты, это называлось, давайте я их напишу, значит, сам Нельсон Олдрич, Пол Варбург.
The name rings a bell. The Warburg Banking House, that's right.
можно посмотреть.
Frank Vanderlip, a Dutch banker, Harry Davidson, Benjamin Strong, and an assistant secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Piort.
Ну, голландские банкиры, да.
Да.
Гарри Дэвидсон. Ну, или Дэвидсон, он Дэвидзон на самом деле, ну, как и Харли Дэвидсон. Бенджамин Стронг. Еще там был, ну, как бы такой, знаете, там плюсиком напишу, помощник секретаря казначейства был.
Those guys got together and created a
Товарищи
system.
собрались
What kind of system? They created the Federal Reserve
разработали
System.
вот эту вот систему. Ну, а что они разработали? Вот ФРС, собственно говоря. Систему ФРС.
The reason I listed them here is that when people ask who's part of the Federal Reserve System, this is hint number one. And now we want to know who is Aldrich. It turns out his best friend was J.P. Morgan, a banker who stayed in the shadows.
А оказывается, у него друг был, лучший друг Нельсона Олдрича, тот самый Джи-Пи Морган. Тоже банкир, который не стал светиться. Но, как вы понимаете, если у тебя есть управляющий твой, там, Нельсон, да, ты ему поручаешь что-то, вот он делает. То есть друг, якобы его, тот самый Джи-Пи Морган.
And the daughter of Aldrich married John Rockefeller Jr. So these people called a committee and created the Federal Reserve System.
Дочь за Рокфеллером. И вот эти люди, да, вот они собирают вот эту комиссию, решают, что давайте...
So when the question arises who's behind the Federal Reserve System, I think we need to look at these names. At least it's the first time we talk openly about it. To me, it's clear that Morgan, Warburg, and Rockefeller took part in it. If the roles of others are questionable, then those three are definitely behind the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And those 10 years when major changes happening around the world remain closed. Nobody was supposed to know about the hidden agenda.
Потому что здесь вот это вот происходит, и там никто не должен был сюда вообще лезть.
And after the series of revolutions, they opened up to the world. And in 7 years after that, in 1930, they organized the association and so on. But that is the closing of the deal. Those 5 banks and then 12. We need to look at this committee and this list of names, because those who joined them later were only doing it formally. Let's put it bluntly. All they did later was try to establish full control over these banks. And we see the confirmation of that in all the future crises. After every crisis, another bank that wasn't part of the system became part of it through bankruptcy process. So it all was created with the only goal to control the whole financial system. It happened in spite of the fact that the Federal Reserve System already dictates its rules. We often say that all the banks are the branches of the Federal Reserve System. And yet, it makes the banks directly their own. It buys them. Look, it seems like in all the recent talking about the Federal Reserve System, those 12 banks that were included in the system in 1933 rule. But you say differently. As if first there was the Federal Reserve System, and then the banks were told to join it. And then with every crisis another bank was forced into the system. Yes, it's like a dark room where we don't know who is inside. I mean, we do know that these guys were in there. And then they invite more members in.
Куда разрешают зайти людям вроде, ну давай ты к нам тоже.
Или загоняют, да.
Да, а потом, ну тебе же хочется быть, вот войти в Федеральную резервную систему, вот я теперь такой.
And when the crisis strikes, they simply buy the new bank members. They say, "Thank you, you did great." And that's what they did to everybody. They started with 5, then included 12, and so on. In 1933, they create Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The Great Depression started in 1929.
Депозитов.
Ну, страхование вкладов.
Да, это то же самое. Депозиты и вклады это одно и то же.
People were left with no money.
Понятно было, мы вот что
So if this Deposit Insurance Corporation was created, say, in 1925, and then the Great Depression began, then I'd get it.
Потом началась Великая депрессия.
But when you first arrange the depression, it's a different story. I'll write it down. By the way, they love to call everything great. In our case, it was called horrible hunger that Russians organized for Ukrainians and Kazakhs. And for some reason, ironically, more Russians died at that time. But in America, it's a Great Depression, and the nation's deprivation of gold, to be strict, with the fear of being put into jail. Yet, it's a Great Depression. And that's how they fought it, by developing the Federal Reserve System. 12 banks joined Federal Reserve System in 1930. In 1933, Hitler comes to power, and these guys decide to protect the people who made the deposits. But who's being protected when the people are robbed completely of everything they had? The logic was like this. Since people were poor, then there was a window of opportunity to work on insurance. It was presented as a form of caring for people, and at the same time, here's what happened. At the same time, Federal Reserve System Council got the right to change the reserve requirements for the banks that were part of the system. It started controlling those banks, started telling them how much reserves they were supposed to have. It was pure manipulation. So you come in happy? What are you talking about? It was the time of Great Depression. They were forced to join. Perhaps you're right. Anyway, they survived, teamed up. Then they get told what to do. So you join a private organization voluntarily, and then all of a sudden you're given orders. So in 1930, 1935, the management of those banks took place. Two more key events happened in those days. At the first glance, they have nothing to do with the Federal Reserve System. But they do. On June 6, 1944, I'm going to divide it in half here. Tehran Conference took place when Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met to literally part the post-war world. And right then, from July 1st through 22nd, the Bretton Woods Conference was held. Again, when we're told about it, we hear it together with the history of the Federal Reserve System. And the interesting part is that they met before Bretton Woods and discussed this. In a month after the three of them met and discussed the matter, they started implementing the plan.
Опять же, нам это как-то рассказывают многие об этом, но говорят как? Бреттон Вудс там, то есть в связи с ФРС рассказывают Бреттон Вудс.
What was it? The dollar will be the reserve currency of the world, and that the dollar will replace gold. Yes, the gold was replaced with the dollar here. By the way, usually it sounds like this, $35 for troy ounce. It's hard to remember because not everybody knows what troy ounce is. Therefore, I recommend to remember it as $1.1 for 1 gram of gold. It's easier to remember, almost $1 per gram.
Поэтому я рекомендую всем вот по-другому это запоминать. 1,1 доллара.
And we're going to use this information. And here are two important events I wrote here. The conference and the meeting should not be separated from one another. What is important for us here, that we took part in the Bretton Woods Conference and we signed the agreements. People probably know about that. But then we didn't sign. Didn't validate diplomatically speaking. Listen, it wasn't a coincidence that they met in 1944 and not 1946 because the USSR was badly battered by the war. And all other countries were battered. And until nobody put their foot down, perhaps if you hold a conference like that after May 9th of 1945, then you are talking to the winner. At that moment, Stalin would be sitting and dictating his conditions. But it's a totally different picture in June 1944. Let me remind you that the Second Front was opened in August of 1944. Many people like telling stories that the US won in the World War II. Yet they got into the game in August of 1944. And the very signing of the agreements between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt after the Tehran and Bretton Woods conferences served as the reason for opening the Second Front. That is the logic of the events. So whenever others ask why Stalin couldn't push his way through, you'll know that those two didn't open the Second Front until they made Stalin sign their conditions. They believed they were talking to someone who hadn't won yet. They were talking at that point to simply one of the participants of the World War. And if they started helping Germany, who knows what it would be like. Didn't England have that plan? Operation Unthinkable, that's what it was called. And it was for 1945. And if we didn't take Berlin, but that's another topic. Why wasn't it developed? And why wasn't it implemented? Here's the logic. Stalin agreed to their conditions. Our representatives went to this conference and signed deals. Then the Second Front was opened, and after that, we didn't validate what we signed. From that point on, we hurt some feelings. Operation Unthinkable might have worked then because they saved some German troops there with weapons. That is, they weren't armed, but there were weapons there. So what if we didn't bring tanks to place? If we didn't demonstrate our readiness to keep on fighting, and that we're not worn down? Then perhaps there would be more fighting. It wasn't an easy situation. That's how Federal Reserve System emerges. I also want to write the following dates here: 1971 through 1978. It is the so-called Jamaican Conference. We'll go back from it. Now, what is so interesting about it? Well, the gold standard was cancelled. Look, these events are very close to one another if we look at the whole scale. Not long after it had been introduced, the gold standard got cancelled. Never mind what happened at the beginning of the spectrum. Look at how close they are. Stalin was quick to ask the gold back in exchange for dollars. We're going to move a little bit back in time. What happened here? I'll tell you what happened. In 1965 through 1967, there was a currency exchange. People were smart about it. Remember, 1944 was only a bit more than 20 years ago. People knew that currency was just paper. Everybody probably knows that de Gaulle took a ship loaded with dollars to the US. I'll simply tell you the numbers. He exchanged $750 million for 825 tons of gold. Oh, I see why he was removed from power. Yes, a student revolution was arranged and he lost power. So overall, the USA lost 3,000 tons during this period. Who else took the gold? Germany, Japan, They tried not to make it public when they followed de Gaulle's example. That is why the exchange suddenly stopped. And in 1971, the conference was called. For 7 years, European countries resisted the dollar currency. That is understood. Who needs paper just sitting there doing nothing? And by 1978, they pushed this system through. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by military and oil. I'm going to add to the previous plot what was happening with the US gold reserves. In 1938, their reserves added up to 13,000 tons. That was right before the war. In 1945, this number has grown to 17,700. It makes you wonder who was spending money and who was making lots of it during the war. Certainly, we paid gold for the military equipment. Speaking of help and support, was it help to us or just business? When we buy a loaf of bread at the grocery shop, does the shop help us? Do we owe it a thank you for the rest of our lives? To me, it sounds funny when deals like that are called help. In 1949, the reserves added up to 21,800 tons, which makes 70% of the world reserves at that moment. Well, they provided for allies as well, plus they robbed their own people. Yes, as usual, I didn't just write it because we're going to discuss the following interesting thing. We're going to remember that the gold reserves amount peaked in 1949. Not many people talk about what happened in 1950. We're going to tell our viewers. Stalin simply protested. It wasn't the first time he did that. The first time he protested was in 1945, when he didn't sign the Bretton Woods agreements. And by 1950, he was sure what to do next. What the USSR does is create an alternative system. That's why I mentioned this topic. We often look at things from a single angle as if the Federal Reserve System is the only world system. But in fact, it wouldn't be correct to say so. And starting in 1950, the world gets an alternative to dollar system. It needs to be understood. If we use this sketch of ours, then right here we see a crossroads. It was 1950. Well, I drew it way too long. It didn't last long, did it? Here's what happened in 1950. On March 1st, the USSR Council of Ministers makes a resolution about the ruble to dollar rate rise from 5.3 to 4.0 rubles per dollar. We haven't been told that. It turns out that from 1937, ruble was bound to dollar according to the previous resolution. So when the rate changes, we'll call the step 1 in Stalin against Federal Reserve System power struggle.
Да, был курс вот такой вот доллара, там, с 1937 года он был установлен. Значит, тут выходит постановление.
So a new system was created in the USSR. The ruble is announced to be backed by gold. 1 ruble for 0.222168 grams. This is the key moment.
Объявляется, что рубль теперь тоже основан на золоте, на золотой составляющей. И эта золотая составляющая, значит, равняется за 1 рубль 0,22.
In fact, from this point on, the dollar was also backed by gold. So from this point, there were 2 alternative currencies backed by gold. Stalin didn't sign Bretton Woods, which had tied dollar to gold. This made the dollar rate drop significantly. He tied the ruble to gold. Soviet State Bank set the rate of 4.45 rubles per gram, while the dollar rate was 1.1 per gram.
45 копеек за 1 грамм.
The whole industry and economy were torn apart. This rate ratio shows the two countries' economy ratio. We needed to pay more than 4 rubles for 1 gram of gold, and they only paid $1 for it. That's how worn out we were by the war. On the other hand, the USA has become only stronger after the war. Those are reasonable numbers, and that isn't very important what the ratio is. The important part in all of this is that the world currency emerged. This is just the numerical part. And right then, with no stops in between, Stalin calls the economic conference in April of 1952. I'll make a correction. It's not the two currencies that we're talking about here. It's the two systems. The logic is simple. If you create new currency on Timbuktu Island and back it up by gold, nobody's going to use it. It will simply be odd. You're absolutely right. Those are the two alternative systems. Two alternatives. So during this economic conference of 1952 in Moscow, the Eastern European countries and China agreed to create a trading zone that would be alternative to the dollar.
Восточная Европа плюс Китай решают создать зону торговли, значит, альтернативную доллару.
Many other countries got interested in this. I'm going to list them. Iran, Ethiopia, Argentina, Mexico, Uruguay, Austria, Sweden, Finland, Ireland, and Iceland. All familiar names.
Австрия, Швеция, Финляндия.
Iran sounds familiar. Argentina, Ireland, Iceland, which are now trying to get out of today's world system. They were always friends of ours. I mentioned China separately because here's what happened in April of 1952. In March 1953, Stalin died suddenly, and it becomes clear why. It's easier to understand it this way. It wasn't just somebody scheming based on racial discrimination. It was like this. Hey buddy, look what kind of game you're playing. You made a golden ruble and then offered this system to the whole world. And half the world was ready to join you, as it turns out. The truth is, the Eastern Europe and China became friends right away. And here's what I find interesting and why I wrote China. As soon as Stalin dies, we know that Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader at the time, turned away from the Soviet Union, because this was destroyed by Khrushchev. Usually when people talk about Khrushchev and list his mistakes, like planting corn everywhere, they don't mention the key event. When Stalin had been pushed aside from developing the alternative system, Khrushchev immediately quarreled with China, and the Chinese started treating us like enemies. And they were right, because that was it. No alternative had been left, and the only choice was to go cap in hand to the US. That's how interesting it gets when you just learn about the history of the American Federal Reserve System. Let's continue this. The system of conversion ruble existed, but then it was destroyed. Right? With the beginning of reforms in 1985. Yes, we discussed this with the leading economists that we've had 3 types of rubles in our country. Cash, that was used to pay while shopping. Bank transfers, that was used to build our industry. It never crossed with cash. Therefore, the building of large constructions such as railways and power plants never led to inflation growth. And the third was the transferable ruble. It's a peculiar system that was built. It didn't let the inflation grow. It didn't let the prices go down under right circumstances. But right after Stalin's murder, the system wasn't removed right away. You're right. It was disorganized much later when Gorbachev came to power. Completely different landmarks come out of this picture when you look at it from this perspective. You begin to understand who did what. What was done by Khrushchev and then by Gorbachev by looking at this. Everybody cleared the road for this major line. And in here, it started in 1950, and in 1953 we can put a cross on it. In order for us not to finish on a pessimistic note, we have to say that right now we are doing a similar thing again. As Putin puts it, we offered a single economic space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. You can join us. However, we can't even brag about our success with Belarus, even though we have one state and one currency. The good news comes from Novorossiya, but they are also being very careful about talking about it. First, we hear that they're going to use the ruble to pay salaries and pensions. Then they correct themselves and say they're going to use whatever comes into the budget. If we have rubles, we'll pay rubles. If we have dollars, we'll pay dollars. If we have hryvnias, we'll pay in hryvnias. So we can't even come back to what we had not long ago. Let's do a summary. First, we had a creation of the Private Bank of England. It also drew paper money and did what it wanted. Then it all moved to the USA. There was a goal in doing so. Then private banks started to form here. And the private banks became subject to control from a unified system. There was the first bank. Its license didn't last and it got closed. Then there was the second one. Another failure. It got closed. Then, through a series of troublesome events, the idea got pushed through. Then the third bank wasn't called the third bank so that people didn't associate it with the first two. Otherwise, it would be too obvious. It was covered. They called it the Federal Reserve System. The word federal was the misleading part. And after that, the world trouble began. A wave of military coups advanced throughout the continent. Then the World War I, which allowed the US dollar rate go up. Before the war, we had strong currencies like ruble, British pound, German mark, French franc. In other words, there were many strong currencies. But after the war, after everybody killed each other, the currencies of the world weakened. And the dollar went up while on a separate continent. And another thing, during the war, the money flows to where it's calm and quiet. This country gets the profit from military equipment supply of food for that matter. Of course, it's all about who benefits from all of this. Who started the war? Those who made profit during the war. Here's the result. What do we see next? All banks joined Federal Reserve System. It grabbed more and more control with its tentacles. One by one, other banks got sucked into this by those who started Federal Reserve System. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Warburg. Then there were two important events. The Bretton Woods Conference, when the dollar gets backed by gold, and after that, there was the Jamaican Conference. So you are saying that the second front opening is related to the Tehran Conference and signing of Bretton Woods Agreement? So when we agreed the second front was opened? Yes, I am. And when the war was over, when we signed the peace treaty, then we declined ratifying the agreements. That was an interesting game until 1945. Then they had to talk to the winner. And the winner has completely different demands. There was an attempt to pull Operation Unthinkable. It becomes very clear why the nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. In 1945, when we declined signing the agreement, nuclear bomb lands on Japan, on poor Japanese. It wasn't necessary at that point. Japan practically surrendered. And England bombs Dresden at that point. They did it together. Yes, as an intimidation operation. Jamaican Conference didn't just happen. It wasn't a simple unbinding of dollar from gold, but rather the consequence of the crisis when many countries, starting with France, de Gaulle, shipped paper dollars back to the US. I'm telling you, many countries got it from 1945 to 1965. In 20 years, it became so obvious to everybody that paper dollars were simply loaded onto a ship and sailed to hand them in before it was too late. It had been going on for 2 years. Then it stopped in 1967. Then they were desperately thinking what to do, called the conference, annoyed everybody there, and finally unbound the dollar from gold. And at the same time, our viewers might be curious to know that an alternative system emerged in 1950. The ruble got backed by gold just like the dollar. And right away, to keep the momentum, another conference was called in 1952. Eastern Europe and China talk about a single economic space. Looks like it was the USSR's answer to the Bretton Woods Conference. Oh yes, and in March of 1953, Stalin dies. What an interesting story. You did a good job putting the events in such order. Some things didn't seem related to me before, and when you put it this way, the picture becomes much clearer. It's like a 3D picture of this system, which clearly crawls towards the world power. It's doing so slowly, carefully, step by step, arranging wars, crises, hunger, Great Depressions, and so on and so forth. It seems to care nothing about how many people die in the process. It's blind to it. What's important to us is that we have an example right here, and we have something to align ourselves with to create our own alternatives. Let's hope for the best. However, the consequences may be extremely negative. We need to keep that in mind. Thank you, Dmitry, for a great interview. I hope our viewers like your research.